Hi everyone, I'm Sally and this is Life is Org AU YouTube channel. And today we're looking at the Sparking Your Wellbeing series. And I'm very happy and excited to have a special guest. Her name is Anne Wicking. She is a community spirit. She's done so much for the community. She's moved from, CEO of Compassionate Friends Victoria, to being a consultant, to being the co-founder of a podcast series. So we've got lots of questions, and today's subject is communication. So I'd like to hand over to the lovely Anne and just ask you about, communication tips to enhance your well-being. Do you have, I'm sure you have a myriad of ideas and suggestions, but I'd just like to hand over to you for your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks, Sally. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be with you and everybody listening today. Communication is such a big subject area, isn't it, really? And which part do you tackle first? But I suspect in terms of well-being, one of my greatest tips about communication is with self-communication, and actually how we don't do that very well. You know, we've got that little voice in our head all the time that's giving us all these messages about not being good enough, or about we should have done better at that, or whatever. So the first thing is to start to listen to ourselves a little bit more and really listen, not just, but what are the messages that we're giving ourselves every day? You know, how much of our day is spent in giving our messages about how we're not, versus how much of the day we spend in giving our messages about how we actually are doing a good job.
Thanks, Anne, and absolutely true. We really need to, be in touch and have a greater sense of who we are in the big picture. And I was just going to say that obviously there's a lot of research to say that healthy relationships impact our well-being. One of the things that we find in, healthy or unhealthy relationships is that conflict often appears, and it can escalate us into a pathway that we actually don't really want to be on. And obviously that has a whole lot of triggers in our body. Knowing what you know, and I know you've done a lot of study into CIQ, which you'll tell us what that is in a minute. Sure. But how can we bypass or take the highway to non-attachment and not go into those triggers?
Okay. Look, yeah, you're right, Sally. CIQ, for those that don't or know it or never heard of it, it's actually conversational intelligence, and it's really based on neuroscience. So what happens in the body and the brain when we're communicating and when we get those triggers. So there's enormous amounts of research now into the area. Fortunately, we're just recognizing with fMRIs that are available that we can actually really get to know what goes on in the brain and how we're operating in all forms of communication. So your question about what happens in conflict and how do we sort of stay okay in that in CIQ terms, there's a really important point here to talk about, and that is that what happens for most of us when we're in a situation of potential conflict, or not even conflict, but we have differing opinions on something, is that depending on what that differing opinion is, that very often what will happen to the brain is that we get what's called an amygdala hijack. And for those that don't understand that, the amygdala is part of the primitive brain, which used to serve us very well in the old days when we used to have to fight tigers, because we'd either have to fight the damn thing or we'd have to flee from it. But today, that's still very active, that part of the brain, but it gets activated unnecessarily. But when it gets activated, what happens in communication is it releases a neurotransmitter called hormone called cortisol. And when cortisol floods our system, one of the things that it does, apart from making us want to fight or flee or appease, is that it actually disconnects us from another part of our brain, which is the front part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex. And in that is where all of our wisdom, our rationale reside. So if you think about it logically, you're in a conversation with someone, they've triggered a response that has caused you to want to either go to fight them, fight for your opinion, fight for your perspective, or you want to just run away. So that's happening. At the same token, you're disconnecting from any form of rationale, which means that you can't, I don't know, have you ever been in an argument where you've been standing there or you've been in a conversation with someone and you're just going, I don't know what to say. I'm confused. I can't bring my thoughts together to pose a really solid response. Well, that's exactly, it's very physiologically. It's very physiologically. You've got all of this stuff just happening in your body with all of these hormones running around, disconnecting you from your rationale, and bang, before you know it, you're in an almighty argument.
Wonderful, Anne. I'm learning so much. Thank you.
Pleasure, Sal.
Yeah. So I have a question. What possibilities have you noticed open up out of listening?
Okay. I think the first thing is that, talking back to CIQ again, it's really important that we build trust. And one of the quickest ways to build trust with someone is to really be listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. And it's so important that we learn to hold the space for someone else, for them to just share what they need to share with us.
So, Anne, how can we listen better?
Yeah, good question, Sally. I think the thing is that we often forget how to listen well, or we have not been taught how to listen in the first place. And I guess the best way to share that with you is, let me just share some tips with you that I've learned through the conversational intelligence that really do work well. The first is we need to listen to connect with people. Often we're listening to either confirm what we think we're hearing someone say to us, to judge what someone is saying, particularly if we're in a sort of a conflictual situation or someone's got a different opinion to ours, or we're actually physically wanting to reject what they're saying. So the very first thing is listen to connect. The second, and I think most powerful one, is to ask questions for which you have not got any answers to. So what that means is, and they're usually the questions with the what, the how, the when, the why. So you're not wanting to elicit a yes or a no response, because if that's all you're getting, it's really, really difficult to actually understand what someone is saying. You're not listening to connect, you're just listening to confirm, judge, or reject. Along with that, you need to double click for understanding. So if someone responds to you or you're hearing something and you're not sure what they're meaning, ask another level question down. Ask them to say, look, I'm not sure what you're saying here. Could you perhaps say that in a slightly different way so I can hear it differently? And the third way to listen, which sounds interesting, is to stay really open and curious. So don't go into a conversation where you're listening to someone else thinking that you already have the end result answers, that you're really curious about what they've got to say.
Absolutely. Can totally relate to that. And remember times when I don't know, we have this program in us sometimes that we don't want to appear silly, and we think we have to have the answers. So how wonderful to stay curious and learn so much more about the world and the other person or the subject. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
And what are your quick tips for people to be able to listen with compassion and kindness?
The first one is to, before you start to have a conversation with someone, is actually just be there with them for a couple of minutes. There's a lovely little exercise which I'm happy to share with you guys on the YouTube or put it in the show notes, called You, Me, We breathing. And it literally just takes a couple of minutes, or actually 10 seconds before you start a conversation, where you just share a breath together and connect in with people. So that's number one, is you've got to be in the same space as the other person. I think I said earlier to you, so important to hold the space. In other words, if you're listening to someone, it's not about you wanting to quickly jump in and give your response to a question, but just rather sit back and listen and let people speak out their truth.
And what are your top 3 gems to share with others that you've learned from your own experience about listening?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, Sally, because as you mentioned early on in the intro, I run a podcast. And one of the things that we found most helpful in terms of being able to listen is to be quite organic with the conversation, not go in with a list of questions and fire them off. Because if you're really trying to hear someone, if you've got pre-existing questions to ask them, then sometimes you're not allowing them to speak what they need to speak at the time. So my first thing is try and have organic conversations. Don't go in with a whole whack of questions, because it may not be where that conversation needs to go at that moment. So that's one of the great things that I've learned out of doing the podcast. In terms of being with people, the other thing that I've learned is that not very much time is ever given to actually people saying what they need to say. Like, we quickly jump in and want to either give them an answer to something or a response to something they've said. And that therefore sometimes cuts them off. So give them space. Give them as much space as they need to actually say what they need to say. So I guess they'd be my two key top tips.
I think that's a wonderful point about listening and about holding the space, but also about letting people really say what they need to say. And that fits like a glove with Indigenous wisdom, with Native American hachoka or talking circle, which is not about everyone talking at once. It's about people listening while one person talks, and about listening to yourself when you're talking. And obviously in Aboriginal wisdom, it's Dadiri. So a very, very well-matched, philosophy with what you're talking about. So thanks.
Oh, well, we learned from our ancestors anyway. Whatever we've got today, it's come from our ancestors. So.
Absolutely. And like we say, there's nothing really new. It's just how we spin it. But it's been absolutely wonderful. And I just want to say what a pleasure, and have so much gratitude, admiration for you and the way that you really contribute to the community in a real, authentic, accessible way. So thank you so much, Anne. And I guess the last thing is, how can people get in contact with you if they'd like to?
Sure. Well, look, I've got a website. It's pivotlife.com.au, so people can pop on there and they can email if they want to, or we've got they can DM on our Insta, which is pivot_partners. So very happy to hear from anybody that's interested in a bit more about communication and listening.
Beautiful. Thank you, Anne. And I'll have all those details in the description, in the YouTube description box. Look out for this video, everyone. Thank you so much, Anne.
That's a pleasure. Thanks, Sally.
See you.